Hey class, in this video we're going to be talking about random and how to use random to add some variation to our design to create a pattern using the loop project that we did in the last video. So we've used random a bit before in class. We're going to go over it in more depth today, and we'll look at ways to use it to create variation both in terms of size, spacing, position, and color in our design. So let's get started. I'm going to open up GitHub and I'm on the 210 branch. So I'm going to go to show and finder. And so I'm going to make a new version of my pattern project. So I'm going to duplicate pattern version 1 and this will be pattern version 2. Just like we did with some of the other projects, I'm going to have multiple different versions. So you don't have to have two versions of this one, you just have to have one. So I'm going to delete the thumbnail here, and then I'm going to open this up in Sublime. And here's my pattern version 2. I'm going to go to sketch.js and I'm going to delete everything here and say this is my pattern version 2. So this is going to be a generative pattern. It's using random. So I'm just going to set up a basic sketch. I'm going to create a canvas. Get my draw function set up, draw a simple background, and then I'm going to open this up and then we'll talk a bit about what we'll be working with in this video. So I'm going to start my Sublime server, open up a new window, go to localhost 8080, and I'm going to add in pattern v2 in my URL. So there's my canvas. I'm going to open up the console and let's talk a bit about random. Randomness basically means something that's unpredictable. So if we're trying to make something that looks more natural, we might want to use randomness, and that's what I'll use it for today. There's a lot of other reasons why you might want to use randomness, but we'll talk about this one first. So I'm going to go back to my other pattern for a moment and just point out a couple of things. So in this pattern, all of the mountains have the same height. And the trees all have the same size, and there is some variation, but it doesn't look very natural. Like if you saw a real mountain range, you'd probably see something more where there's some mountains that are large and some mountains that are different sizes like that. So if we wanted to make a mountain range with some variation, one thing we could do is just draw a bunch of different triangles. Okay, so we'll look at a version like that. But we could also continue using our loop, which draws each triangle with one line of code in a loop, but then add some randomness to the values in that loop so that these numbers that determine the height of each one of the triangles would be random. And a way that we can do that is using the random function. The random function is based on something that we can do in JavaScript, which is called math.random. So if I say math.random, you see I get a random number between 0 and 1. And that's always just going to be the case with math.random. It's never going to be anything above 1 or below 0. But it's a very long floating point number, and it uses some very complex math to create something that's unpredictable. So a simple application for using random might be like a coin flip. So if I wanted to make a decision and it was a 50-50 decision, I could use random and then compare it to 0.5 or half of 1. So if I said math.random is greater than 0.5, there's basically a 50% chance of that being true. You might make a program that will flip a coin. When you flip a coin, you can use a random event, heads or tails, to make a decision. We could compare a random value to something that has a 50% chance of being true or false. I could even write a simple function, flip a coin, say if math.random is greater than 0.5, return heads, else return tails, and then I could flip a coin. Heads, tails, heads, tails, heads, heads. So we can use randomness for different things, for drawing, we're going to want to be able to have randomness within a wider range than just 0 to 1. And so we could do that just using math. We could say math.random, times 100. So we'll get a larger random value. But P5 has a random function that allows us to be a little more specific as far as what our random values are. So if we go to the P5 reference, go to math and random, the random function can take either 0 or 1 or 2 arguments. It gives a number in the range of the arguments that it's given. So if we just use random, so that's the P5 one, that gives us the same thing as math.random, a random value between 0 and 1. However, if we give one argument, it will use that argument as the minimum or maximum value. So if it's 10, we'll get a random number between 0 and 10. And if it's a negative 10, we'll get a random number between 0 and negative 10. So depending on which direction you go, it'll either be the minimum or the maximum value. But the other value in this case with one argument is always going to be 0. If we had 2 arguments, then we can create a range. So if I have random between 5 and 10, then the value is always going to be somewhere in between 5 and 10, although it is random. We can also have a random value from a negative number to a positive number, negative 10 to 10. So that could be anywhere between negative 10 and 10. And so we can see some of those numbers. So using randomness, we can add to our sketches to create some unpredictability as far as where things end up. So I'm going to look at using randomness with the sketch that we created in the previous video to make a generative landscape, or a landscape that's always different. And we can look at some examples of generative landscape. So I'm just going to go to Google and type in generative landscape. And if we just look at some images here, you can see there's a lot of different kind of approaches to this. So there's some that are more abstract. There's some that are, topographical. So there's a lot of different interpretations of what a generative landscape might look like. So when you're working on your design, you don't have to use, landscape, we tend to think of things from nature, but landscape could mean a lot of other things. It could mean a digital landscape. It could be the landscape that you're looking at on your computer. It could be interpreted in a lot of different ways. So I'm going to be using, mountains and trees and clouds as kind of like a, pretty straightforward landscape, but feel free to interpret landscape however you think would be most interesting. So let's go back to our new sketch. So that's pattern V2. And let's start with our mountains. So I'm going to go over this again, and I'm going to make a few changes. So I'll talk about what I'm changing as we go. So I'm going to start again with X. So we'll start at X equals 0, and X is less than width, and X plus equals 100. So remember, this is basically just saying we're creating a loop, and in that loop, we start at 0 for X, and then we add 100. So that brings us to 100, and we keep doing that to 200, 300, 400, and we keep going until we get to here, and that's when we stop, when we get above whatever the width value is. So that way we're just going to make mountains at each one of these intervals. So that way I know that my mountains are going to cover up the background. So I'm going to show a couple different ways to do this. So let's just make the mountain first. So I start with the fill as, I'm going to choose a slightly different brown color this time. I also want something a little bit darker than some of these. So I don't see really the color I want, so I'm going to go to the color picker and just move this around. So something like that is kind of nice. So there's just like a tiny bit of red in there to make it more brown. Something like that. So I'll use that for now. So I'm just going to copy those RGB values instead of a name value. Okay, so that's my fill, brown. And so I'm going to do my triangle. And this time I'm going to do no stroke just to keep it a bit simpler. So I'm going to start with my triangle. So again, I start at X, and the way I'm creating the triangle is I'm basically just saying, the first point is at x, whatever that happens to be as it goes across, and then the next point goes over a bit, and then the last point goes over a bit. And then for y, so those are our 3 x points, and then for y we start down here, then we go up here, and then we go back down there. So that's how we get our mountain triangle. So I'm going to say triangle x, and then for y, I'll start at height, and then x plus 50, and then height minus, or let's just do a number here. I'll do 200, and then x plus 100. And then for the last value, we'll do height again. So we'll go back down to the bottom. Okay, and so let's make a couple changes. I probably am just like repeating what I did yesterday, but let's move x back a bit, maybe just a little bit. Okay, and let's move the height up further. Okay, so we have some basic mountains. And so the mountains all look the same because this top value for y is always just 100. So that's one place that we can add randomness to create a more natural look. And so one thing that we're going to notice from the very beginning, so I'm going to change this value here. One thing that we're going to notice from the beginning is that if I make this value random, because we're using the draw function, it's going to be drawing over and over again at different random numbers. So let's say I put a random value here, or let's put it on a different line so we can read it. So let's say let y equals random, and we can say something between, let's say 50 and 200. And so then I'll put y in for that y value. And so now we're going to see this sort of weird animation where the mountains are going up and down a lot. So you might think that's cool and you could, leave it like that. But as far as the design goes, I don't really need any animation or motion in this one. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to remove the draw function. And so what I can do, instead of drawing the draw function over and over again, I can change the name of this function to pattern. So if I change the name of that function to pattern, at first nothing's going to happen. But as we learned in the previous lesson, I can call that pattern function. So I can say pattern, and then I'll call it once. And then let's set up a little event so I can call it multiple times. So let's say function mouse pressed. And let's call pattern again. And so now anytime I click the mouse, we're going to run that pattern code again. And because we're using randomness, every time I click, we get a new sort of landscape. So we can make other things random here. So let's spend a little bit of time making some other random values, and then we'll move on to the other parts of our scene. So another thing that we could make random is how much space there is in between the mountains. And so I could just replace this number with a random number. I could say random between 100 and 200. So now you only see a mountain, at random intervals. So again, it kind of adds to making things seem a little bit more natural. So then we can also add some randomness to the sides of the triangle, how far apart they are. So instead of 50, we could say random, maybe between 50 and 100. And instead of 100, we could increase that to random between 100 and 200. This line is starting to get kind of long. And those mountains are a little bit too weird. So how can we do that in a slightly better way? Well, instead of using two different random numbers, we can use one random number and then divide by half to get our values. So why don't we get W for the width and say that's random between 100 and 200. And then instead of adding two random numbers, we can add width over 2 to our middle point and width to our third point. So now our mountains will have this middle point will be halfway between the starting point and the ending point. So again, we get a little bit more evenness here. We can also set the randomness of the interval relative to this. So if we make this bigger than that interval, then our mountains are going to take up more space. Okay, so now we get kind of a nice mountain range, some nice overlapping mountains. We can even set the randomness for where x starts so that we don't always have basically the same starting point here. So we want that to be before 0, so we could say random -100. So now we get the range starting at different points. And we could even like increase that value by a lot, so then we can kind of see the other side of a mountain range at some points. So that's pretty cool. We've got some random mountains. And finally, the last thing we can kind of randomize is the colors in the fill. So we kind of have like a general range for these colors. There's a couple of ways to do this. I could just like write random in right here, and that'll give us some random values. Or if we want to make it a little bit easier to read, I can use some variables. So I can say r equals random 82, let g equals random 65, and let b equals random 51. So again, you can just put the random numbers right directly into the arguments, but if you want it to be a little bit more readable, then you can create some variables with some random numbers. And so with these, since I'm just using one number, the lowest value is 0. And I'm okay with that since the mountains are going to be kind of in the background. I want them to be like a bit darker. But you can see now we get a lot of different colors in the mountains, which is kind of nice. If you wanted them to be closer, then you might want to make these ranges a little bit smaller. Like I could have 50 to 82 for the red. So there's always a certain amount of red in there. I could do the same thing like, 40 to 65 and 30 to 51. So then now there's a little less variation in our colors. So you can change the sort of range of randomness for your different values to change the output on the other side. So it is random, so it's a bit unpredictable. You might see something that you don't expect, like you might not think that there could have been green, but you see a little green. And so then maybe you say like, okay, I want there to be less green, so I'm gonna lower this number a little bit. You do need to have a little bit of green, because if you always have 0 green, then you're never gonna have like sort of lighter reds or blues. So you can play around those numbers until you get something that has the right color palette for you. So we've got our mountain range. Let's do our trees next. And as you're looking at this, you can really make anything random that's a number. So if there's something that you think could be random that I don't work on, or if you have like a different design in mind, just think about all the things that are numbers. So things that are numbers are the red, green, and blue values of the color, the X positions of our shapes, like the triangles. Here are all the X positions, the Y positions like here and then down here, and then the size, like the width of each triangle. So all of those things are numbers and therefore can be random. So with our trees, we're gonna do something very similar. We're gonna just like kind of randomize some different values. So let's build our trees that we had before, and then do some randomness. So we'll say we'll use X again. So we're going from left to right across the page. So we'll say let X equals, let's just say 0, and X is less than width, and then X plus equals, and we can use some randomness here. So let's say random between 25 and 50. So we'll have a lot of trees. And then let's just draw our tree first. So we're gonna say fill. I think I used rosy brown for the tree trunks yesterday. And then we'll just draw a rect. And I can't forget to set my rect mode to center. It's not necessary, but I think it makes it a little bit easier if you're combining rectangles and circles to use that. So our rectangle will start at X. And then we're gonna obviously have random heights for the trees, but let's start with just a number. So we'll say it'll start at height minus 50. So 50 pixels up from the bottom of the canvas. And then the width of the tree can be kind of small, like 20. And the height of the tree is gonna be 100, so 2 times that 50. Let's actually make the trees a bit skinnier. Let's do 10. And so we can see that because we're using random here, the interval in between trees changes each time. So that's pretty cool. That's already kind of nice. But let's randomize a couple other things. So what else can we randomize about the tree? We can randomize actually where it starts at the bottom. It doesn't have to touch the bottom of the screen. We can randomize how tall it is. We can actually randomize how wide it is. And then we can also randomize the difference between where it starts and where it ends. I guess that's the same thing as how tall it is. So let's start with that. So basically all of these numbers. So we can randomize the width of the tree. So we can say let W, and so we can say random. Maybe our skinniest tree would be like 4, and our widest tree would be like 10. And so then I just put in W there. Again, you can just put random directly into the argument, but then it starts to make your code look a little bit longer. So let's just do the width here. Okay, so we have different widths. So then let's also do a random height. So the height can be random between maybe 50 and 100. And so this way we have to actually apply it in 2 different cases. So the height of the tree is this 100 over here. So we can just put the H there. And then that actually kind of looks okay. We maybe can just leave 50 here. But if we put H over 2 here, that's how we would get the trees to stick to the bottom. So depending on what you want for this case, H over 2 is fine. If you are happy with the trees kind of at different points, then maybe 50 is good. So we're bringing the trees up a little bit. And then, that actually is nice because it kind of adds a little bit of depth. Some of the smaller trees that are also skinnier look like they're kind of in the background a little bit. Then we could also randomize this number as well. So we could call that Y. So the offset for the Y from the height. So maybe we'd say let Y, and that can be random between maybe, if we're going up from the height, maybe we'd just say 50 and see how that looks, and then we can change it. So we have Y there. So that actually looks pretty good. I think that looks nice. I actually kind of want some more trees here. So if I want more trees, basically this random 25 to 50 is how much space there is in between each tree. So like it's a random number. The smallest it could be is 25, so maybe something like that. And the largest is 50, which maybe is like this. So if we want more trees, then we want a smaller minimum number over here. So maybe we just make it like 5. Okay, so now there's more trees. We could also increase the maximum number, so there's just a wider range. So that leads to fewer trees, but there's a possibility there could be a lot of trees if we happen to get a streak of smaller numbers. So there's more variation here. So one of the things that you have to think about when you're designing with randomness is whether you want more or less variation. If you want something to look basically the same every time but with small little changes, or do you want a ton of variation where you can't really predict what the outcome is going to be? I'm actually going to change the background color real quick. I'm going to make it light blue because I think that'll stand out a bit better. Although then it's the same background as my page, so maybe I'll choose a different blue. Maybe I'll go with this light cyan color. Okay, that looks pretty good. So let's do the leaves for the trees, which before I was just doing as like an ellipse. So we'll just make an ellipse. I'll do the fill is green. We'll do an ellipse, and we'll do in the same place X and height. And I'm going to do -H this time. So I'm going to keep working with the height of the tree here. So the H is going to match the top of the tree, hopefully. For the width and height, I'll just start with, I think it was like 50 and 25 or something like that. No, it was the other way around. 25 and 50. And then I actually got this wrong. So what did I get wrong there? I guess it's just -Y. No, it's -Y minus H over 2. So that one's a little complicated, but basically I'm starting with the height, but then since the rectangle is rect mode center, that means that basically if I start with my rectangle here, the XY position is right here. And so if this is the height of the canvas and I want my tree to be here, X obviously is fine because that's right in the middle. But first I have to start at height, and then I have to subtract Y, which gets me to here. And then to get the rest of the way up here, that's subtract H over 2, because the whole rectangle is H. So that gets me to right here, and then I can draw the top of my tree. So it's a little bit more complicated, but again, you don't have to do the exact same thing that I'm doing, so don't worry about that. Okay, so then we have some nice trees. A good thing to vary here could be the width and height of the tree. Since I already have a W and an H value here, let's make a new one. So let's say tree width is random, and let's say 10 to 50. We can try that and then update it. Tree height is random. Let's say, well, I don't really need them to necessarily always be the same. So let's try both as 10 to 50. So then I'll do tree height, or whoops, that's width, tree width, and tree height. Okay, so it does look pretty dumb when they're kind of wider than they are tall. So let's make sure that doesn't happen. So let's make sure the lowest tree height is like 40, and the highest tree width is like 40. So that way we know the tree width is always less than the tree height. Another way you could do it is you could actually use the tree width. So we could say tree width, we could set tree width first and then use tree width and tree width times 2 for the tree height. So it'll always be something larger than the tree width. That's another way we can do it using our variables. So that looks pretty good. And then of course we can also make some variations in the color. So let's delete this green here. And I did this last time, but let's get the values for green. So 0, 28, 0. Don't need that RGB, just those numbers. And then we can do some random numbers. So we can say variable R. So for red, if it's going to be green, we don't need a lot of red. So let's say random like 50. And for green, we want green. So let's make sure it's bigger than whatever red is and, you know, something higher. And then for blue, same thing as red. We don't need a lot of that. And so then we can fill these in, R, G, and B. And then let's put a little comment here to say random green. Okay, so now we have different colors for our tree. So that looks kind of nice. A little bit more natural. Still, you know, looks like a computer drawing, but it's a little bit more similar to what we might see in real life, where not everything is exactly the same height. And so then our last thing to do is our clouds. And this one, instead of going all the way across the screen, I'm just going to make a random number of clouds. So this is another way that we can do this. Instead of using like starting at X and going across to width, we can just create a random number and then loop the amount of whatever that number is. So I'm going to make a variable called number, or let's call it cloud number. Say random, we'll say the fewest clouds is 3 and the most clouds is 10. We can always change that later. And then let's say for let I equal 0. So now I'm going to use I instead of X. Since I'm not actually using the X dimension of the canvas, I'm just counting a number. I'm going to use I here. So I is equal to 0, I is less than cloud number, I plus plus. And so our clouds were just kind of like a cluster of ellipses, but they all looked exactly the same. So this will be nicer because we can randomize it a bit. So first let's come up with an X value. So we'll say let X, and the X can just be anywhere on the canvas. So I'm just going to say random width for X. Whoops. But then Y, we don't want anything too low because that's where our trees are. So we'll say Y is maybe like half the canvas or above. So somewhere between 0 and height over 2. So that's actually pretty easy because I can just say Y equals random and then height over 2 instead of width. Then we can just make some clouds based on those random numbers. So we're going to fill white again. I'll use white just so that's clear. And we'll do an ellipse at x, y. And we can do a random width here. So we can say let w equals random, let's say 50 to 100. And we can do a random height as well. So maybe the height can be kind of the same value. So then we have ellipse at x, y, width and height, all randomized. And so now we have some random clouds, but we want them to kind of like cluster a bit. So instead of, let's make them a little bit smaller first. So instead of 100, let's say 50. And let's make these like 20. And then I want to make a little cluster. And so what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to put a loop inside of my loop. And we'll talk about this a bit more next week. But something that I can do is just put like another loop inside of here. There's nothing wrong with that, just like I can have an if statement inside of another if statement. So I'm going to do the same thing again, but this time I'm going to do a cluster. So I'm going to say variable cluster number equals random. This will be smaller. I'll say between 2 and 4. And then I'll say for let j. So here's a tricky part when you're using loops. Since I have let I, if I have another loop inside of this loop, I need to use a different variable because I can't do I again. Or I could, but it would lead to weird things. So I'm going to say let j equal 0. And I'm just using j because it's the next letter after I. And so j is less than cluster number, j++. And I'm not actually using j for anything, so I don't really need, once I've got my loop done, like I don't reference I again, I'm not going to reference j again. I'm just going to add some randomness for the x. So I'm going to say plus random -10 to 10. And same thing for the y. So I'll make a little cluster for each one of my clouds. I can't really differentiate them. I think we need a darker background color. So let's call this, let's do dark blue instead. Okay, there we go. So I don't really like the way my clouds are turning out, partly because I think they're too tall. So let's change that. And then I think the cluster needs to be a bit more diffuse. So if they're too tall, that means I want my height to be bigger than my, or no, I want my height to be less than my width. So let's change the width from 40 to 60. And the height, let's just do 20 to 30. And then let's make this cluster number a lot bigger, so those clouds can get farther away from each other. Okay, that's getting a little bit closer. So that's getting closer to what I want, but I actually want the y to be closer than the x now, I think. Okay, that's looking pretty good. And I want a bit more randomness, so I'm going to put 80 here and 40 here. Okay, that's starting to look pretty decent. It's not perfect, but you can kind of see the direction I'm going in with this. We have these different kind of cloud shapes. So yeah, that's a bunch of different places where we can add some randomness and a few different ways to use loops. Okay, so I'm pretty happy with what I've got here. So I'm gonna just save a thumbnail. So let's call this thumbnail.png. And let's put that in our project folder so we can go ahead and publish this. Okay, and I'm gonna change the name from pattern version 1. Since this is our first generative landscape, I'm just going to change the name to that, generative landscape. So then let's add another link on our main page. So on index.html, I'll scroll down here and just copy this and paste it. And so this is pattern version 2, pattern version 2, and pattern version 2. So this is for loop plus random. And this is our generative landscape. And so let's take a look at that. So that looks pretty decent. We have our first one and our second one. So for the homework, you can, this is just kind of preparing you for the second one, but you don't have to make a version 1 of this. You just only have to make the generative landscape version. So I'm, labeling mine, but just make one project. Don't make 2 projects for the homework for this week. And yeah, when you make your own landscape, try to make something original. I don't want to see a bunch of mountains and trees and clouds. Those are just kind of the examples I'm using, but think about different things that might be in a landscape. Think about different locations, like you could be on the moon, you could be underwater, and try to create a setting that would be interesting to you. And feel free, you don't have to just use P5 shapes. You can use images, you can use all sorts of different stuff on the canvas. So it doesn't have to be, exactly the same thing that I did. I've had students that made landscapes with emojis. So there's a lot of different stuff that you could do there. You could use text. So feel free to, think about different ways to achieve that and different meanings of what a landscape might be. So that's it for this video. I'm going to go over to GitHub and commit all of my work. So I'm going to say adds generative landscape and then commit to master and then push to origin. And that's it for now. Let me know if you have any questions. You can email me or chat me on Discord or ask me in class.